The black egg cracked at dawn, and my ninth dragon climbed out of it. 9 sets of wings went up around me, and the valley went dark. Across the tally field, my brother's stolen champion tore free of its handlers and knelt at my feet. He was screaming that it was impossible. It wasn't. It was just bones. Every heir in the valley bonds a dragon egg at 16, and the egg does the choosing. The gold one lit for me before I even reached the dais, the highest grade the right had marked in 200 years. My brother Edmund lifted it off the cradle, named himself its keeper, and my father let him. What they left on the cradle for me was the dead egg, black, cold, and silent for 100 years. Briar, 3 years promised to me, crossed the dais and tied her ribbon to Edmund's wrist instead. She follows the dragon, my father said, like it was weather. The hall laughed as the herald read my inheritance, 1 egg, presumed hollow. Edmund's gold egg was already humming through its shell. Mine didn't even hold the torchlight. It drank it. But when my palm touched the shell, words rose out of the black like heat. Brood mother vessel, bond limit none, none. It does not hatch 1 dragon, it hatches all of them, feed it. Edmund was still laughing when I crossed the dais and put my fist through his smile. They sentenced me within the hour, stripped of my house name and posted to the Boneyard, the grave valley where the kingdom dumps its dragon dead. They thought they were burying me with the bones. The Boneyard gate was a dragon's jawbone planted upright in the earth, taller than my father's hall. I carried the dead egg, threw it on my shoulder, 5 days of prison cart behind me and nothing ahead but fog. The guard didn't follow me past the jaw. Nobody ever did. Beyond the gate, the fog thinned, and the valley showed me what 100 years of dead dragons looks like. Ribs stood in rows out of the pale grass, tall as ship hulls. Skulls sat in cairns with the teeth still in them. Wing fingers arched over the path like the frames of burned houses. Everything the kingdom had ever flown and buried lay sorted in this one grave. They had dumped me in it like one more carcass. The warden met me at the first row with a lantern. It was old and narrow and hard. A fence post that had outlived 3 fences, with grave dirt worked so deep into her knuckles it had become their color. She asked my name. I gave her the half of it they'd left me. Maud looked at my split knuckles a long moment, then at the black shape lashed to my back and priced us both at nothing. Exiles dig, she said. You'll dig where I point. You'll sort what you dig, and you'll stay clear of the deep vault, or I'll bury you myself. That was the whole welcome. She pointed me to a lean-to against the heir wall and walked off with the light. 2 grave hands watched me pass the sorting tables, a gray-bearded one and a boy, and neither was stupid enough to say anything to a kinstriker with a sentence on his head. She worked me until dark on day 1. I dug collapsed dirt off a wing the size of a barn roof, and the tags on the sorting tables taught me the yard's one law without anyone saying it. Every bone sorted by line, every line shelved apart. Wyvern with wyvern, drake with drake. I'm king line behind iron. Maud's dead were filed like a library. At dusk, she pressed a wooden chit into my palm, my week's bone tithe, 4 coppers drawn at the hunter's post 2 valleys down, and left me to the dark. That night I built a fire outside the lean-to and set the egg where the heat should have reached it. The flames bent toward the shell and the cold one. Wind moved through the rib rows and made a low sound, 1 note, the whole valley humming over its dead. I turned my hands in the firelight. Split skin across 4 knuckles, the print of my brother's tooth still in one. 16 years in that house, and this was the full inventory of what I'd carried out. 1 dead egg, 1 bruise, half a name. The plan was 3 lines long. I said it out loud to the egg, because there was no one else left to promise. Feed the egg, grow the brood. Take back the gold. The shell had said it plainest. Feed it. The sorting table nearest my lean-to held the day's last haul, a wyvern's ribcage tagged for interment. I broke a rib loose. It was long as an oar and lighter than any wood. I laid it against the black shell. The surface moved. It went soft, the way deep water is soft, and the bones slid into it like something swimming down. I watched the rib's shadow thin inside the black fray and come apart. What the shell pushed back out was a palmful of gray ash. Then heat, the first heat the egg had ever given, and words rising off the shell like the ones in the hall. Lineage accepted, wyvern. I brood, 1, forming. I brood, 1, forming. I stood very still in a graveyard at midnight holding a handful of ash and started to laugh with no sound. Then I fed at the rest of the rib cage, bone by bone, while the moon crossed the valley. With every bone the black went deeper, and thin white lines crawled the shell like veins. Near dawn the veins pulled tight. The egg rocked once, then it cracked, not like breaking, like a door finding its hinges. A claw the size of my thumbnail hooked through the gap, and my first dragon climbed out of the shell my family had called dead. He was the size of a house cat and the color of the bones that had made him. bone pale, wet-winged ribs printed under his skin like his lineage was still legible. He shook himself, sneezed ash across my boots, and looked up at me with eyes like lamp oil. Words gathered over his back and waited. Wyvern line, designate, WR. Dirge, I said, because the bally had sung nothing else all night. Designate, dirge, brood, 1. He bit my thumb, decided I belonged to him, and pressed his back against the shell that had birthed him. Behind him the crack drew itself shut like a healing cut. The egg sat whole again, cold again, waiting again. I didn't get to enjoy it. The heir gate boomed. They came over the low wall with the last of the dark, scavenger drakes, fox-sized, mange-gray, a dozen of them flowing like rats toward the bone shelves. Their leader was dog-sized and iron-hided, with a jaw built for stripping graves. I grabbed the fire iron out of the coals. Dirge woke like he'd been paid to. The first drake came through the gap in the gateboards, and I broke its skull with the iron before it cleared the shadow. The second one hit me at the knees and put me down in the ash pit. Teeth found my forearm and ground on the bone. I got the iron across its throat and pried, and it screamed and writhed loose, and the pack poured past us both, because none of them had come for me. The leader went for the egg. A straight line, no feint, no hesitation. It knew exactly what in this yard was worth stealing. Everything always did. Dirge stood over the shell. He was a quarter of the leader's size, wings still wet, an hour out of the egg. He opened his mouth, and his whole ribcage lit white through the skin. The sound it made was a kettle. What came out was a needle. A thread of white fire took the leader through the left eye at 3 paces. It dropped mid-stride, slid to Dirge's feet, and was ash from the eye inward before it stopped moving. The white flash lit the heir wall like noon. The pack broke on that light. They poured back over the wall and did not take their dead. Dirge closed his mouth, and the fire under his skin banked like coals. When the dark came back, 3 torches stood at the end of the row. Maud, the graybeard, the boy, all of them staring, shovels held like pikes they'd forgotten to be holding. The boy whispered it first. Grave blessed. The graybeard made the sign of the turned spade over his chest. They weren't looking at the egg, a black stone in the shadows behind a standing whelp. They were looking at me. The bleeding boy the Graves had answered. Maud swung her lantern over the egg on her way past it, and the shell gave her nothing. No heat, no words. A black river stone with delusions of size. The words rose from my palm and no one else's, and I understood that the shell had picked its secrets the same way it had picked its keeper. I said nothing. I let the yard tell it the way the yard wanted to tell it. Maud came and walked the whole line of it slowly, lantern low, 1 drake with a caved skull by the gate, 1 leader burned hollow from the inside out, 1 bone-pale whelp standing guard between them. 100 years I've worked this yard, she said. It gives back fog and it gives back rot. It has never once given back wings. She pulled the warden's ledger from her coat, wrote by torchlight, and turned the page so I could read the fresh line. Axe, day 1, yielded, 1 whelp, living, line, wyvern, keeper, the exile. Keeper. Edmund had taken that word for himself in front of the whole right, and my father's hall had cheered him for it. A grave ledger handed it back to me over a dead thief with a burned-out eye. I pressed my torn forearm against my side and signed the line with a thumbprint of my own blood, because the yard deserved the keeper who bled for the entry. The grave hands hauled the dead drakes to the rendering pit in a barrel. Maud posted the boy on the broken gate and left without another word, which from her was a promotion. But Dirge didn't follow me back to the lean-to. He stood stiff-legged at the mouth of the deepest row, staring down it, the coals coming up under his skin again. At the end of that row, past the last iron shelf, sat the door Maud had sworn to bury me over. The deep vault, iron, black with age, set straight into the valley's root rock. I walked down until the fog turned cold enough to bite, and the one law of the yard fell apart in front of me. Nothing down here was sorted. Nothing down here was shelved. The vault wasn't built the way you shut things away from thieves. It was built the way you shut something in. Then I saw the stone lip under the door. Grooves ran through it, long dragged gouges, 4 to a set, deep enough to lay my fingers in. They started under the iron and ran out toward my boots. Claw marks. On the inside, reaching out. Dirge made a sound I hadn't heard from him yet, low and flat, a note with a warning filed into it. I picked him up and his eyes never left the door. 100 years ago, in the valley where my kingdom buries its dragons, something had clawed to get out. I carried my dragon and my egg back up the row, built the fire high, and slept with the egg between me and that door. I took my tithe chit to the hunter's post at the end of my 3rd week, and I took Dirge with me. 3 weeks of marrow and grave tallow had made him the size of a pony, and the walk that should have taken half a day took less because half the time I rode. Those 3 weeks had not been idle ones. Every dawn before Maud's work bell, I flew him at kite targets of hide and bone off the ossuary roof, and I taught him 2 calls until they sat deeper than instinct. The wind side. And down. A methodical man with one weapon sharpens that weapon until it frightens him. The egg had stayed quiet through all of it, not sulking, sorting. The yard's daily hauls were splinters and gravel bone, nothing whole enough to carry a lineage, and the shell refused to eat scraps the way a king refuses soup. So the notch count stood at 1, and I walked to the post with my 1, and my 1 walked like he knew what he was worth. Carter met us on the valley road, took 1 look, and pulled his mule so far into the ditch the wheels tilted. As we passed, his hand made the sign of the turned spade, and he bowed his head, not to me, to the wings. The story had walked down out of the yard ahead of us. The post sat at the crossroads 2 valleys down, a long hall with an antler and bone trophy wall, and a slate board of bounties out front. Hunters went quiet in rings as we passed, the way water goes quiet around a dropped stone. A bone-pale wyvern walking to heel will do that. The clerk behind the pay window turned my chit over twice like it might be counterfeit. Post rule, he said, sliding it back. No coin crosses this sill to the nameless. He said it loudly enough to share. The laugh that went around the post was smaller than the one in my father's hall, but it was the same laugh. A broad man in a captain's harness leaned on the trophy wall, and the laugh belonged to him first. Boyd, they called him. He ran the muster. The graveyard sends its rat down to us, he said. Dig your coppers out of the mud like you dig everything else. Dirge's throat started to glow, and I put 2 fingers against his jaw, and the glow banked. Not for this, not for a laugh. I stepped past the window and read the board instead. The slate's top line was fresh chalk. Stormdrake, bull, dented in the black marsh, 40 silver. It had emptied a calving pen and taken a herdsman's arm, and the muster had failed on it twice. Under the chalk, in old painted letters, the post's standing rules held the whole board up. Paid to the hand that drops it. Triple, while the calving pens stand open. The pens stood open. I could see them from the board, and so could the drake. It hit them while Boyd's muster was still saddling. It came down the marsh wind with the sun behind it, slate gray and barn broad, and peeled the pen roof back with 1 pass of its hind claws. Screaming stock, screaming men. Arrows went up and came back down bent. Boyd bellowed for lances, and the drake answered the lances first. Its tail came around like a ship's boom and swept the muster line off its feet, and I watched 3 hard men learn why this bounty had chalk dust on it from being written twice before. The muster was 40 heartbeats from reforming, and the drake was 0 heartbeats from leaving with a calf. I was already moving. Dirge, the wind side. He went up the trophy wall and off it like a thrown spear. The drake banked off the pens with a calf in its foreclaws, and it turned into the wind to climb because heavy flyers always turn into the wind. Dirge was waiting inside the turn. He hit the bull's wing at the joint and sheared down the sail with all 4 sets of claws, and the sail opened like sackcloth. The drake dropped the calf into the mud and came around screaming, jaws wide enough to take a pony whole. Wide jaws was what Dirge wanted. His ribs lit white through his skin, and the kettle sound rose, and he put a rope of bone fire straight down the bull's open throat. The storm drake hit the pen mud like a dropped roof. It bounced once, plowed a trench through the muck, and lay still with smoke coming out of its nostrils from the inside. The calf stood up out of the mud and started bawling. Nobody else made a sound. Dirge landed on the dead bull's shoulder, folded his wings, and looked at the muster the way the muster had looked at me. Then the crowd split, and a herdsman came through it with 1 sleeve pinned flat to his shoulder. He walked to the bull that had taken his arm, and he set his boot on its jaw, and he stood there while his breathing went wrong and came right again. When he turned to me, he didn't say anything either. He just looked the way you look at weather that arrived on the one day you needed it. I found out later his name went on the yard's gatepost that week, the first of many, a debt written in chalk by people who don't waste words. I walked to the pay window through all that silence and laid my chit on the sill a second time. Then I tapped the old painted rule under the chalk. The hand that drops it, I said. The beast is mine. Warden's ledger, day 1, signed in blood. Ask the yard. The clerk looked at the ledger boy. The ledger boy nodded so fast his cap slid. The clerk counted out 120 silver in stacks of 10, and his hands shook on every stack, and the whole post watched him do it. And 4 coppers, I said. He paid the 4 coppers. Boyd didn't laugh when I passed him on the way out. He looked at Dirge for a long time, and then at me, and his jaw worked like a man chewing a word he wasn't ready to swallow. Luck, he finally said. Grave luck. It runs out. Come to the yard when it does, I said, and left him standing under his trophy wall. We took the Stormdrake skull home on a hired mule sled, because the post suddenly had mules to hire me. The story ran ahead of us the whole way. The grave blessed exile, the bone-white wyvern, the dead bull. Nothing in it was true except the wings, and that was fine. The truth was, waiting at my lean-to, black and cold and patient. That night, with the yard asleep and the fog pulled in like a curtain, I fed the egg a Stormdrake skull the size of a wheelbarrow. The shell went soft and drank it the way the marsh drinks a boot. Gray ash, then heat, then the words. The lineage accepted. Stormdrake, EWW, brood, 2, forming. I fed it the neck bones after, one by one, and the white veins spread and tightened, and before the moon set the egg rocked and cracked along its old healed seam. The second one came out shrieking. She was slate gray from nose to tail tip, and sparks walked between her teeth when she yawned. Where Dirge had stood quiet and priced the world, this one bit the world first to see if it would bite back. The words gathered and waited. Storm Drake line, designate, designate. Squall, I said, and she screamed like she was agreeing. I designate, squall. Brood, 2, I-D. Dirge put one forefoot on her back, flattened her into the ash, and held her there until she stopped screaming. Oldest sibling. He had decided what he was the moment she hatched. I carved the plan into the lean-to's doorpost that night, all 3 lines, deep enough to outlast weather. Feed the egg, grow the brood, take back the gold. Under the second line I cut 2 notches, clean and square. 2 notches, 2 sets of wings. The counter had a home now, and every notch after this one was a promise with a blade behind it. Squall learned to fly in 4 days, off the OSU airy roof, in a storm, because of course she picked the storm. Dirge herded her out of the lightning by the scruff, twice. Maud watched them fight the wind over the yard, and her hand made the sign of the turned spade, and then she wrote something in the ledger, and I have never once asked what. On the 5th dawn, I saw the rider. He sat a tall roan on the east ridge, in a road-gray cloak with a slate in his hand, too far to hail and too still to be lost. Squall chased Dirge across the sunrise, and the rider's chalk moo. He was counting. 1, 2. Then he turned the roan south toward the capital and put his heels in, and the fog took him. Men who count your wings don't ride that hard to keep the number to themselves. Someone had just carried my tally to the people who had thrown me away. The news from the capital reached the yard the way all news reached the yard, late and smelling of mule. What happened down there that spring I had to fit together afterward, from Carter's, from a sealed report I was never meant to read, and, in the end, from the handler himself. But I know it now, all of it, so I'll tell it the way it happened. The gold egg hatched at the spring festival, in front of the whole capital, on a dais built for exactly that. They say the shell came apart like a struck bell, one clean note, and the sound rolled off the palace walls and set every roost in the city answering. What stood up out of it was worth the noise. Gold from crest to tail fork, scales lapped like coin mail, wings that unfolded and kept unfolding. Measuring cords made it a wingspan of 20 spears on hatch day, the largest the rights books had recorded in 200 years. The herald, the same voice that had read out my inheritance, one egg, presumed hollow, proclaimed it the double-crown champion. The city rang bells for a day and a night. My brother stood on the dais through all of it with his hand on the champion's neck, accepting the kingdom's love like rent that had come due. But the Carters had also heard the other thing, the thing the bells were played loud to bury. The champion screamed at night. Not sometimes, every night. By day it flew the parade circuits gleaming, took the saddle, took the crowds, perfect as a minted coin. Then the sun went down, and in the deepest stall of the royal roost, the finest dragon in 200 years screamed like something was standing in its stall that no one else could see. They packed the roost walls with wool. They moved it twice. They doubled the grooms. The screaming moved with it. A roost handler, a careful man, 20 years in the trade, went over the champion scale by scale one dawn while it finally slept. Under one gold scale low on the left flank, he found a fleck of gray, small as a fingernail paring, dull as ash, wrong as a maggot in an apple. Gold scales do not grow gray. The handler did what careful men do. He reported it up, and the next morning a steward in my brother's colors sat him down at a clean table, slid him a purse that outweighed his year's wage, and slid him a paper beside the purse. A contract of silence drawn tight as a snare, with room for his mark at the bottom. Another man would have used a knife. My brother used a signature, because a knife only kills you once. The handler signed. The purse went home with him. The fleck stayed under the scale. And the bells kept ringing, and the kingdom kept celebrating its double-crown champion, which screamed every single night in a stall packed with wool. That is what I fitted together afterward. What I knew that spring was simpler: 2 dragons on my roof beam at dawn, and a rider on the ridge who had counted them. I worked the pair every dawn now, and they had stopped being 2 animals and started being one argument. Dirge held the high wind and drove the kite targets down. Squall came up under them out of the fog, jaws first. Day they took 3 kites in one pass without a call from me. I stood in the wet grass and let myself feel it for exactly one breath, and every night the shelves talked to me. That was the ugly truth of my situation. I slept 100 paces from the largest store of sorted, pure line dragon bone in the kingdom. A wyvern with wyvern, drake with drake. A brood of 50, racked and labeled, one feeding at a time. One night I stood in front of the wyvern shelf with the egg on my back for a long time, and the egg was warm against my spine, which it only did when it was close to what it wanted. Then I walked out and shut the heir door behind me. Those were Maud's dead. She'd buried half of them with her own hands, and I had signed her ledger in blood as their keeper, not their thief. I had watched what taking things you hadn't earned did to the takers. I had a scar on my knuckle shaped like the lesson. The egg went cold slowly that night, like an argument it intended to win later. The answer to his counting came 11 days later on a roan lathered to the shoulders. Not to the post, not to the village, to us. The courier wouldn't come past the jawbone gate. He nailed a scroll to the bone itself, crown seal at the head, and was back at a canter before the echo of his hammer died. Maud cut it down and read it in the fog with her lantern up, and I watched her face get older. The words were lacquered in law, but law was my mother tongue once, so I'll say it plain. A royal tally, the first in a generation. All bonded assets of every house, every dragon, every drake, every winged thing under bond, presented at the capital for the count. In 60 days. Tallies aren't for counting, Maud said. Tallies are for claiming. Whatever stands outside a house's column when they close the book, the crown writes into its own. 2 sentences. She'd buried enough history to know which 2 mattered. I looked up at the roof beam, where Dirge sat like a carved thing watching the ridge, and Squall hung upside down off the gutter working on her one bad habit. No house, no name, 2 dragons. In 60 days the law would walk up that road, look at my wings, and ask one question, whose column? I took the scroll off the gate, went to the lean-to and split a plank off the woodpile. I cut 60 short strokes into it, 10 to a row, 6 rows, square and even. Then I hung the plank on the doorpost under the 3 carved lines of the plan, and I crossed out the first stroke with one pull of the knife. 59. Maud watched me do it from the row end, lantern low. They're going to count my dragons for me, I said. That night I sat with my back against the egg, and the egg was cold, and the cold felt like patience. Somewhere south, a gold dragon was screaming at something nobody could see. Somewhere south, 60 days of law were already on the road. Let them come counting. I planned to make the number hard to say out loud. Squall heard them first. It's like she came off the roof beam screaming at a pitch that keeled me out of sleep with my hand already on the fire iron. 9 days after the summons, at the black hour when even the fog lies down, men came over the south wall of the Boneyard with ladders, mufflers, and 2 covered carts. Gogers. Crops. But the word is too small for what climbed my wall that night. These were professionals of the bone trade, a dozen of them, in grave gray so the rows would swallow them, with wrapped tools that made no ring. They had a map of the yard shelves. I watched one check it. They knew Maud's watch turns, and they had timed the moon, and they went for the heir the way men go to work. 2 of them met the boy on gate watch and put him down with a sap before he got his bell up. That was their one mistake. The bell wasn't the yard's alarm anymore. I whistled the high call, and the knight answered on 2 sets of wings. Dirge came off the heir roof in a silence that was somehow louder than Squall, who came up out of the fog floor under the ladder crews with her jaws crackling. I gave the second call, the one that means hold, not kill. Men are not kite targets. And a yard full of dead men buys a rope, not a future. So my brood went to work the way I drilled it against the day I hoped would never need it. Dirge took the first ladder crew at the wall top and pinned both men flat under one spread foot each, wings mantled over them, fire glowing through his ribs an inch from their faces, a promise held unspent. Squall put herself between the carts and the wall and let the lightning walk her teeth in the dark. Horses have opinions about that. Both cart teams bolted the wrong way, back into the yard, and jackknifed their own escape at the gate. The rest broke exactly the way the drape pack had broken, and found the wall higher on the way out. A man dropped the map. Another dropped a crowbar on his own foot and had to be carried. The one who had sapped the boy ran the wrong row, met me at the end of it, and made the second mistake of his professional life. I broke nothing on him that wouldn't mend. But I took him down into the ash pit and tied him to the rendering hook, and I was not gentle, because the boy's scalp had bled a stripe down his ear. By first light we held the field, 1 prisoner, 2 abandoned carts, 1 dropped map of my yard with Maud's shelves drawn in a stranger's hand. The boy sat against the gate with his head wrapped, grinning like an idiot, because the story was already worth more to him than the cut. Maud came down the rows and looked at the carts for a long time. They were loaded. That was the thing that made her old that morning. The crews had worked fast and clean, and the first cart already carried a full third of the east shelves, sorted, labeled, packed in straw, pure line by pure line, ready for a market that pays minted gold for the kingdom's buried dead. Grave robbery with a bill of lading. Maud put her hand flat on the strapped-down bones of a drake she had buried herself 20 years ago when it fell burning out of the pass. The yard doesn't take back what thieves have handled, she said. That's the oldest law I keep. Once they're torn out, they're lost to the ground. Then she looked at me, not at the egg, and the look was the longest conversation we'd ever had. Salvage falls to the warden's judgment. Do what you do with it, I don't ask. She walked away up the row, and I stood there understanding, slowly, that she had just told me she wasn't blind. The prisoner talked before noon. Professionals always do. They have nothing personal at stake. Hired at the crossroads, half in advance, by a man in gray with his house badge covered and a steward's chain under his collar. Minted gold, too clean for the bone trade. A list of shelves in a clerk's hand. And one instruction that made no market sense at all: strip the yard before the tally. I wrote every word of it down, and I made him put his mark to it, and I kept that paper the way my brother kept his purse-bought silence. Two could play at signatures. That night, under a moon with witnesses, Maud on the row end, the boy on the gate, the gray beard pretending not to look, I unstrapped the salvage card and fed my egg like a king's table. The ember drake went first, the one from the past, the one Maud's hand had rested on. The shell drank 20 years of grave cold out of those bones in one long swallow, and the ash came off my hands like flour. Ember, lineage accepted, ember drake. Ember druid, 3 forming. The veins spread wider this time, and the heat came up off the shell in visible ropes, and the old healed seam opened before midnight. The third one didn't shriek and didn't price the whirl. He came out slow, heavy in the shoulder, ember red deepening to char at the wingtips, and he yawned once and looked around for the warmest thing in the yard. Then he walked to the rendering pit, curled into last week's coals, and went back to sleep. Ember drake line. Designate. Red Maw, I said, and he opened one furnace orange eye and accepted it. XO designate, Red Maw. Brood 3-0. Dirge inspected him. Squall bit his tail to see what he'd do, and he did nothing, at length, with tremendous dignity. A quiet one, a loud one, and a patient one. My family was becoming a better one than the family I'd lost. I cut the third notch in the doorpost, square and clean, under the other two. Then I crossed the day's stroke off the countdown plank. 51. The raid had handed me one more thing, and it was the biggest thing, and it was made of paper. Next morning I rode a salvage cart horse to the crossroads with Maud's ledger under my arm, and the poacher's marked confession folded inside my shirt, and I walked into the magistrate's office at the crossroads and asked to see the Crown's book of vacant contract. The Boneyard's warden of record had died 60 years ago. Nobody had ever claimed the post. For 60 years, the kingdom's Grave Valley had sat legally headless because no man wanted to own the place they threw the dead, and now a dozen professionals with a steward's gold had proved exactly what a headless yard was worth. The claim price for a vacant crown wardenship was surety of 100 silver, posted against the holding's care. I stacked the Storm Drake's bounty on the magistrate's desk in stacks of tin, and it was the best spending of money in the history of money. The magistrate, a dry little man with ink to the elbows, counted it twice, stamped the contract, and slid it across. Understand what you've bought, he said. This holds the yard. Every bone, every wall, every right of salvage. It will not hold your wings. At a tally, beasts answer to houses, and you haven't got one. I know what I bought, I said. I'd bought the ground. The wings I'd defend another way. I rode back through the village at dusk, and the word had outrun me the way it always did. Warden. Half of them still said it with a sneer. But they said it. It was on paper now, and paper is a thing you can make a kingdom eat. I nailed the charter to the heir door under the lantern, where the next dozen professionals could read it before deciding how lucky they felt. Where the report of that night went, I pieced together much later, so I'll tell it now and be done. A man in gray climbed a marble stair in the Capitol in a house with my old name on the gate and made his report to a desk in a shadowed study. The yard defended, the crew scattered, the salvage lost. Wings, 3 now, counting. The hand on that desk wore a signet, and the crest on it was the same crest pressed into the wax of my exile writ. Not my brother's desk. My father's. 45 days out, I got greedy, and the yard taught me what greed costs at a graveside. The second salvage cart was the problem. The first had been shelf stock, sorted and pure, and it had given me Red Maw clean. The second was the poacher's floor sweep, a jumbled half-ton of loose bone from a dozen lines, raked up in the dark by men paid by weight. This, sorting it properly, was a week's work. I had 3 wings, a kingdom coming to count them, and a plank losing a stroke every dawn. So one night, I stopped being a sorter and started being a shoveler. I fed the egg-mixed bone by the armload, fast, like stoking a furnace. The shell took the first load and went still. AJPRLT arborists. Rejected. Misty breasts and J-Rise AG. The bone sat on the black surface and did not sink, like offerings a god had declined, and then the shell pushed them off into the ash. I should have stopped there. I want that written plainly, the egg told me, and I heard it, and I kept going. I sorted by torchlight in a hurry instead. Fendrake, I decided. A whole Fendrake, when half those bones could have been Drake to any eye more honest than mine that night. 2 lines are cousins. Same marsh, same size, plates a shade apart. Close enough to fool a tired liar. Close enough, almost, to fool the egg. The bones sank. Comparious. The words came up, and for the first time, they came up wrong. Tase. Lineage. Unstable. Purity 9 of 10. Proceed. The shell had never asked me a question before. Questions are what things ask when the answer matters. I was 45 days from losing everything I'd built to a clerk's column, and I put my palm flat on the shell, and I proceeded. The veins came in gray instead of white. The heat sputtered like wet wood. All night the egg labored, and the sound from inside was not the sound of a door finding its hinges. It was knocking. At dawn, the old seam opened slowly, without strength, and what came out onto the ash did not move. I will describe my dead one once because it deserves to be in the record, and then I will let it rest. It was small, smaller than Dirge had been, and it was two animals that had tried to be one. Fendrake webbing on the left side, Myredrake plate on the right, and where the two lines met along the breastbone, neither had won. Its wings were folded the way wings fold when they have already decided not to open. The egg's words came up one last time that night, dim, like words said through a wall. Effort, fast, ask. W, fast, asses of Karmer. No number. The counter would not count it. The counter would not count it, and I had done that. Me, with my palm and my hurry. Dirge came down off the roof beam and stood over the little body a long time, reading it with his nose the way he read everything. Then he spread one wing and covered it, and Squall, who had never in her loud life been quiet, was quiet. Redmaw came up out of his coals and lay down against the shell's cold side, as if warmth was a thing that could be lent backward. Maud found us like that at Workbell. She looked at the covered shape and at my face, and she did not say any of the things that were true and useless. She went to her hut and came back with 2 spades, and one of them she put in my hands. I buried 402 winters. Once, she said. You get one grave. Dig it well. We dug it past the frost line. In the east rows where the morning light lands first, and Maud showed me the yard's own right because I did not know it. You turn the spade at the end. Blade to the sky. The ground takes back its own. The boy came to the graveside with his cap off and asked, very carefully, what its name had been. It didn't get one, I said, and the saying of that sentence out loud was the exact size and shape of the mistake. I did not feed the egg for 2 days. The shell went colder than it had ever gone, a cold that frosted the ash around it, and I let it because both of us were thinking. On the 3rd night I came back to the second cart with a lantern, a trestle table, and no hurry left anywhere in my body, and I built the thing I should have built the first night, a method. Bone by single bone, tooth wear reed under the lantern, grain and weight in the hand. Marrow scent checked twice, because it turned out I had been sleeping 100 paces from the finest lineage readers alive. Dirge could smell a line the way Maud could read a ledger. I laid the bones out, and he walked the trestle rows with his nose down, and everything sound he touched once, and everything mixed he raked off the table with one contemptuous foot. Squall learned the game in an hour and worked the piles from the other end, showing off. Redmaw lay under the trestle and radiated, which, in his opinion, was helping. It took 4 nights. Yeah, I know. 4 nights, for what greed had promised me in 1. At the end of it, one pure line lay assembled on the table like a completed argument, a copper worm, green bronze, even in death, every bone vouched for twice. I fed it to the egg slowly, in order, skull last, and the words came up white and certain. Lineage accepted, copper worm. G proper, vor, forming, D props I. She hatched on a clear morning in front of the whole brood, and she came out green as weathered bronze and precise as a jeweler. She did not shriek and did not sleep. She looked at the ash around the shell, found it untidy, and began arranging it. Xi copper worm line, designate verdigris, I said. Asked. Designate verdigris. Brood, 4 mimes. By sundown she had sorted the remains of the second cart into stacks by line, unasked, better than I could, and I stood there watching my mistake get corrected daily, forever, by the one who came after it. The yard keeps its lessons where you can see them. That's what the rows are. I cut the 4th notch under the road map and I crossed the stroke 40 days, and then the boy called from the east rows with his voice pitched wrong, clearing the rejected pile down to ground. He'd broken through a crust of old ash, and under it the earth changed. Bone, but not the yard's bone. Glass, black, mineral, half turned to stone, fused into the valley floor in a seam that ran toward the deep rows like a root. Older than Maud's oldest ledger. Older than the shelves. Older than the yard. Ah! Dirge put his nose to the seam once and pulled back like it had bitten him and would not touch it again. I fetched Maud. She looked at the black seam for a long moment, and I watched her follow its line with her eyes, down the slope, into the fog, to where the deep vault's iron sat in the valley's root rock. She didn't say a word. She posted a lantern over the spot and walked away with her jaw set. The yard was older than the yard, and whatever it was built on ran straight under that door. Maud came for me at dawn with a ring of iron keys I had never seen, and the oldest one was black. Bring the egg, she said, and bring your quiet one. It's time you knew what you're warden of. We went down the deep row in fog so thick, the rib arches swam in it. Dirge at my shoulder, the egg on my back, warm as a banked coal, warmer with every step, and I noted that, and said nothing. Claw-marked iron door I'd stood before on my first night was not the vault. It was the vault's lid. Maud turned the black key, and the door swung on greased hinges. She had never let it rust all these years, and I filed that fact where I filed everything about Maud, and behind it, stairs went down into the valley's root rock. We descended past the reach of day. The stair opened into a pit the size of my father's great hall, and I stopped walking because I understood in one look what I was standing in. A mass grave. A mass grave, not rows, not shelves, not tags, not rights, not turned spades. Dragons, hundreds, dropped from the lip above and left where they landed. A century of dignity abandoned in one hole, wing bones and spine bones in a tangle no sorter would ever undo. The yard above was a library. This was what the library was built to forget. Dirge pressed against my leg, and the fire under his skin came up and gave us light, and the light climbed the pit walls, and I saw the marks. Claw gouges, 4 to a set, starting at the floor and climbing, some of them reaching higher than a barn roof before they gave out. The same marks as the door lip. Not one desperate thing, hundreds of them. They threw them down alive, I said. Maud stood beside me with her lantern steady, because her hands had done their shaking on this subject 50 years ago. The hollowing doesn't kill clean, she said. It empties a dragon out and wears what's left. She moved the lantern slowly along the pit wall, and the light found wing fingers still hooked into the climbing marks exactly where they had stopped. The crown culled every flight that showed the gray. Culling was mercy. Her light rose to the highest set of gouges, a barn roof up, short of nowhere. The throwing was fear. Then she stopped, the way she always stopped, and let the walls say the rest. She walked me along the pit's edge, and the history came in objects, one at a time, like stones laid on a grave. A child's spade, short-hafted, leaned in a niche with its blade turned to the sky. Hers. She'd started at 9, in the second outbreak, the one the songs don't mention. A stretch of wall by the stair, scored with tally strokes, 10 to a row, row on row on row, into the dark. Her count, from the 2 winters that took the last wild flights. I did not finish counting it. I already knew it ended at 400. She watched me look at that wall for a long time. She looked at the plank-shaped bulge in my coat where I kept my own tally, and she said nothing, and neither did I, because some rhymes don't improve for being read aloud. At the pit's far end, the floor changed and the black glass seam from the east row surfaced again. Wider here, a vein of fused stone dark bone running like a root toward the deepest wall. Dirge would not put his foot on it. He walked around and kept his eyes on where it led. It led to a second door. Iron, black, older than the stair, set flush into the root rock and sealed. Not locked, sealed. Around its rim, wax and lead and iron pressed one over another, seal on seal on seal, dozens deep, generations deep. I raised my lantern to read the nearest, and my own new title looked back at me. Warden of the Boneyard. A different name under each seal. 60, 70 names, each one adding their lead to the rim and their year, all the way back to a first seal struck in metal I didn't recognize. I stood there and did the arithmetic. I had been sold at the crossroads for 100 silver. I had bought the ground. Nobody had mentioned what the ground was holding down. The wardenship was never a gravekeeper's post. It was a jailer's. Now you know what the surety's for, Maud said. And across the door itself, under the seals, the iron was scored from the inside, not 4 gouges to a set, 5. Long, patient, deep, deeper than the pit wall marks, worked over years the way water works stone. Whatever had made them had not been desperate. It had been thorough. Maud let me look exactly as long as I needed to, and then she held her lantern to the first seal, the metal one, the founder's. Stamped into it was a maker's mark, a hammer crossed over an egg. I knew the mark. I had been sleeping against it for 2 months. It was struck into the base of the black shell, small as a thumbprint, half worn. I'd taken it for a scratch the first week and never thought of it again. The same forge, the same hands. The door's first seal and my egg came out of the same fire. The old crown didn't find your egg, boy? I built it. Maud's voice was flat as her ledger. She set her palm against the founder's seal, over the hammer and the egg, the way you set a hand on a headstone. After the first hollowing, the forge masters were given one order: make us a way to grow wings back, faster than the gray can come again. She nodded at my back, at the shell. You're not carrying a relic. You're carrying the kingdom's contingency plan. The egg was warm as a hearth now, and I finally understood why it had warmed all the way down the stair. It wasn't afraid of this place. It was made for it. Maud took me last to the side chamber, and this was the one door she opened with something like ceremony. Behind the same iron I'd read about on a shelf tag my first day, lay the king line os u heir, e. No pit here, no tangle. vaulted stone, and on biers of granite, the mounts of the old high kings, interred whole with their honors, older than the hollowing, from when the crown's dragons were the crown's pride and not its ledger line. The nearest bier held the largest skeleton I had ever seen or imagined. The skull alone was longer than Maud's whole hut. The wing fingers, folded, still reached the ceiling. On the bier's edge, in letters worn round, the High King's own. "The Crown's dead built this yard," Maud said. And the Crown's law is coming to empty it." She set her lantern down on the bier, and her face in its light was 50 years younger and afraid of nothing. "Let one of them rebuild the Crown's flights. I'd call that a fair use of a king." I fed the egg the High King's mount, with the whole brood present, because some feedings are meals and some are coronations. Squall and Redmaw and Verdigris came down the stair in a line. Dirge stood to my right. Maud presided the way she presided over graves, spade in hand, blade to the sky, bone by bone, in order, skull last, and the skull I could not lift, so Dirge and I walked it to the shell together, and the shell reached up for it, black rising like a tide. The veins didn't creep this time. They snapped across the whole shell at once, white as noon, and the frost on the vault floor melted outward in a ring, and the egg, my cold, patient, 100-year egg, rocked on its base and rang, one note, the way they say the gold one rang in the capital. Accepted. -A, lineage accepted. King line. I drowed. 5. Forming. The forming took the rest of the night. We stayed. Nobody suggested otherwise. And at the gray hour before dawn, the seam opened like a gate, and the fifth one stood up and kept standing up, and the lamplight failed at the edges of him. He was shoulder high to me at hatch, old ivory from crest to tail, with a ridge of crown horns already budding along his brow, and he blotted the vault lamps just by being between them. King Lime, designate. Great Bone, I said, and the name came out quieter than I meant, because the room demanded it. Designate, Great Bon, Brood, 5W. What happened next? No one trained and no one commanded. Squall stopped moving. Verdigris folded flat. Redmaw lowered his head to the stone. And Dirge, my proud one who had never deferred to anything in his short, fierce life, inclined his head, one slow degree, the way one officer acknowledges another. Great Bond looked at each of them in turn, and then at me, and something old passed through the room and settled. A brood is a crowd. What stood in the vault now was a court. We came up out of the ground at dawn, 5 sets of wings behind me, and I cut the 5th notch into the doorpost and crossed the stroke. 37 days. Half the plank gone. Half the brood grown. The arithmetic was starting to look like a race on purpose. But before we'd left the vault, while the brood was still filing up the stair and Maud was gathering her lantern, the sound came, once, from behind the sealed door, through 5 generations of lead and wax and iron, a knock. Not a scrape, not a settling. A knock, single, deliberate, unhurried, the sound of something that has waited 100 years and wants it known that it can wait a little more. Dirge's fire came up. Maud's lantern never wavered. "It does that," she said, "when the yard changes." She locked the lid door behind us, all 3 locks. It's been doing it more. 30 days out, the gray came back to the valley, and it did not start with us. It started with a plow drake named nothing grander than Brow Knee, who pulled harrows for the crossroads village and let children sit on his neck ridge at fair time. The one-armed herdsman came to the Jawbone gate at midnight with 6 villagers and a lantern they kept hooded, and none of them would say the word out loud. "Under the jaw scales," was all he said. A patch of it, spreading since Tuesday. And at night, warden, at night he screams. Screams at night. Somewhere south, in a stall packed with wool, a gold champion did the same, and I kept that thought where I kept my knife. The law on the gray is 100 years old and has no second paragraph. Report it, cull it, burn the carcass, salt the pen. They hadn't reported it. They had come to me. Every one of those 6 had a name in chalk on my gatepost, and I understood that I was looking at the interest on a debt I hadn't known I was collecting. We went that night, me, Dirge, and Maud with her spade, in case the night ended the old way. Brownie stood roped in his pen, soaked dark with sweat, eyes rolling white, and under his jaw the scales had gone the color of ash under paint. The whole village stood back at torch distance. Children pulled inside, doors cracked to watch. Dirge walked to the pen alone. He put his nose an inch from the gray patch and read it the way he'd read the trestle bones, and what came off him was not fear. It was recognition. The fire rose under his skin, and he looked back at me and waited for a call. I had one heartbeat to decide what I believed about my own dragon. Bonefire had never once burned what was living. It burned what was dead, and only what was dead. And the gray, whatever the gray truly was death wearing a live animal. "Low," I said. "Slow. Burn it out." Dirge opened his jaws and did not make the kettle sound. He breathed the way you'd warm cold hands, white fire in a slow fan, and washed the plow drake's jaw in it. Brownie screamed once, and then stopped screaming for the first time in 6 nights because the fire didn't touch him. It touched the gray. The patch lifted off the scales like mist off a pond, writhing, and the white fire aided in the air, and what settled back against the drake's jaw was clean brown scale, wet as new paint. Dirge worked the whole animal over, nose to tail, 10 slow minutes, and the village watched a dragon breathe fire onto their plow beast, and nobody breathed at all. When it was done, Brownie shook himself like a wet dog, looked around with both eyes sane, and bit the one-armed herdsman's sleeve for an apple because he could smell one in the pocket. That was the moment the Crossroads village stopped being the Crown's. Not in law. In law, nothing had happened at all, and I intend to keep it that way in this account. But the herdsman took off his cap, and the 6 behind him took off theirs, and he said, "Warden," and for the first time since I'd bought the word for 100 silver, nobody anywhere in earshot was sneering. They tried to pay me. I took 1 apple, for the patient. The story I could not stop, so I let the village tell it the way villages tell things. The grave-blessed warden, whose bone-white dragon breathes mercy instead of ruin, who burns the gray out of good beasts at midnight and takes an apple for it. Grave blessing, fine. The truth stayed home, black and patient, against a doorpost with 5 notches in it. Within a week, the road to the yard had traffic it had never carried, a mended cart gate I hadn't asked for, bread under cloth on the boundary stone, 2 boys from the village asking Maud, not me. They'd identified the true authority, whether the yard took apprentices. Salvation, it turns out, is a better business than fear. It just pays in different coin. And 9 days later, the coin drew the assessor. She came up the yard road in a black lacquered carriage with a royal outrider on the day the plank said 21, and Squall and Redmaw were flying the ridgeline drill, and Great Bone was sunning on the heir roof, which he had begun to overhang. I watched the carriage slow as its window filled with wings. 1, 2, 3, Verd die gree off the trestles. 4, 5, as Dirge rose to see, and Great Bone raised his crowned head into the skyline. The carriage stopped a long moment before the gate. Whoever was inside was counting and recounting and believing it slowly. Then the door opened, and Briar stepped down into my yard. 3 years promised to me. 1 ribbon tied to another wrist while a hall laughed. I had wondered, in the Boneyard's honest darkness, what I would feel when I saw her again, and now I had my answer, and the answer was, careful. She wore the royal assessor's gray, and at her belt hung a seal on a ribbon, and I recognized the ribbon, and declined to feel anything about it in front of her. Warden, she said the title precisely, like a woman stepping on ice. The Crown is assessing bonded assets ahead of the tally. The yard's papers are nailed to the heir door, I said. The wings aren't in them. She looked at me then. Actually looked, the assessment cracking for exactly 1 breath, and what was under it was 3 years of arithmetic coming out wrong. Reeve. The warden will walk you through the holding, I said, and gave her my most official gesture, and watched her repack herself into the Crown's gray. No cruelty. She had followed the dragon, her ledger, her entry, but no door back through either. Some doors seal from both sides. She walked the yard for an hour with a clerk's slate, and she was good, better than the rider on the ridge, better than the magistrate. She logged the charter on the heir door. She logged 5 living dragons where the kingdom's book said 1 exile and 1 hollow egg. She logged the notched doorpost and the countdown plank, and I watched her read the 3 carved lines above them, and I watched her understand them. Feed the egg, grow the brood, take back the gold. Her chalk stopped moving for a moment on that last line. At the gate, she paused, half into the carriage, and tried once more, quietly, off the record, "It wasn't the ribbon." "You should know it wasn't." "Safe roads, assessor," I said. She went. The carriage ran south with the outrider ahead, faster than assessors travel when the news is boring. What she wrote that night, I read much later, in a cracked open file, another sealed page I was never meant to see. 8 words, in a clean clerk's hand under a wax seal, not the Crown's wax. The wax bore my brother's crest, the assessor's findings routed, quietly, to the house that had the most to lose from them. 8 words. The dead egg is not dead, recommend seizure. The offer came first, because my brother always tried the cheap way before the expensive one. A courier under merchant colors brought it to the gate on the day the plank said 16, heavy paper, house seal, clerk's hand, and terms composed to be read aloud in a counting house. 500 gold for the property described as 1 egg, presumed hollow, together with attendant livestock. Attendant livestock. Dirge, who had burned the gray out of a plow beast while a village held its breath. Great Bone, who had stood up out of a king's bones. Livestock, attendant. Underneath, in my brother's own hand, the first words he'd aimed at me since the dais. Be sensible. You were never built to hold anything. I read it twice, and I gave myself 1 slow breath of being 16 about it, and then I was done. I didn't write a refusal. Refusals can be argued with. I turned his offer over, and across the back I set the yard's charter stamp, and under the stamp I signed it, Warden of the Boneyard, and posted it back to him like a receipt. Crown paper over house wax, he would understand. Paper was our mother tongue. The expensive way arrived 4 days later, at dawn, on the day the plank said 12. 40 men in house colors came up the yard road in column, with a wagon, a ram, and a capital writ riding in front like a shield, seizure of disputed estate property, 1 egg, by order, a Bont magistrate's stamp, not my dry little man at the crossroads, a bigger stamp from a bigger desk with my brother's wax beside it. Their captain was a professional. You could see it in how he kept the column tight and in how much he was not enjoying his morning. He had also clearly been briefed on one dragon. Nobody had told him about the weather. Squall had been on the ridge line since the column crossed the second valley. She'd grown into her lineage that month, and her lineage was a storm's, and when the column reached the boundary stone, she stopped riding the wind and started working it. The sky over the yard road went from morning to iron in the time it takes to doubt something. Then, Red Ma walked out of the fog bank ahead of them, unhurried, and breezed on the road. Not on the men, on the road. The packed clay went to glass-slicked melt in a line wall-to-wall, hissing in the rain that Squall was now providing, and the column's front rank watched the ground itself take the yard's side. Ver Die Gris and Dirge rose off the Ossu Air E roof together and hung in the stormlight at either flank, patient as bookends. And then Great Bones stood up. He'd been lying along the yard wall the whole time, ivory against pale stone, unremarked, a hill that had opinions. He rose to his full height behind the gate, spread his crown of horns against that iron sky, and did absolutely nothing else. His shadow reached the column. That was all. It was enough. I walked out to the boundary stone through my own weather and stood across it from the captain, and I let him have his moment of professional assessment. 40 men, a ram built for a farmhouse door, 1 writ, 5 dragons, a melted road, a purpose-built storm, and a warden who kept receipts. I have orders, the captain said, loudly enough for his men to hear the effort in it, to execute this writ. And I have a charter that says salvage in this yard falls to my judgment, I said. Walk forward, and everything that hits the ground becomes mine by law, including the ram. It was the kindest threat I could build him. He took it professionally. He looked once more at Greatbone. Everyone always finished on Greatbone and folded his writ and gave the order, and the column went back down the road in better order than it had come up, which I respected. No blood, no burns, not one man marked. My brood had held a line the way the old flights must have held them, and the only casualty was a road. The boy whooped from the gate, Maud didn't. She watched the column's dust and said, "He'll come himself now." The captain's writ he left with me at my polite insistence. I nailed it to the Ossu Air E door under the charter, the second paper on what was becoming a wall of them. Every document this kingdom aimed at me, I would keep and one day read them all back to it. Then, while the storm squall had built was still grumbling itself out, I did the thing I had been carrying for months. I walked to the boundary stone with a chisel, and the yard followed me, Maud, the boy, the graybeard, half a dozen villagers who'd been delivering bread when the column came and stayed for the theater. The stone's face still carried the old survey mark of the house that held the valley's title generations back, a mark my father's line had absorbed like it absorbed everything. I cut it clean off, one flat stroke at a time. House takes, I said, to the stone, to the witnesses, to the column's dust, to the desk in the shadowed study where this would be reported by nightfall. House permits. House sends soldiers for an egg. I sever. Let the tally find me nameless. And into the blank face I cut a new mark, the only one I had any right to, a hammer crossed over an egg. The forge mark, the maker's sign. Not the blood I came from, the work I was made for. Maud watched me set the last stroke and made the sign of the turned spade, and it looked less like mourning than like witnessing a will. That night, the yard paid me back for the road. Ver Die Gris had kept the second cart's redemption sorted and waiting. 2 pure lines, the Fendrake and the Meierdrake, the very cousins whose mixing I had buried in the East Rose with a turned spade. I fed them one at a time, done right, slow, skull last, with the whole brood present both times. Ask. Lineage accepted. Fendrake, Dopper brood, 6 to forming. Each a brood, 6 to per brood, Meierdrake. 1 Meierdrake, brood, 7 forming. They hatched a day apart. The Fendrake came out first, blue-gray as river ice, webbed to the wingtips, and went straight for the water barrel and sat in it. Tor int, I said, and the words agreed. Exture. Designate Tor int, brood, 6W. The Meierdrake came out black-plated and low-slung, built like a bog takes a cart, quietly, completely, and without any intention of giving it back. On Ix, I said. I designate on Ix, brood, 7WS. Maud crossed the yard for the second hatch with the ledger under her arm and entered them both by lantern light, 2 names in the yard's book before either had dry wings. 2 notches, cut the same night, under 5 others. The stillborn had no name and no number, but these 2 were its memorial anyway. The same 2 lines, grown patient, grown right. 7 wings, 11 days. The week's carters brought the last piece, told low, the way men tell news that frightened them on a road at night. In the capital, they said, you could now hear the champion screaming from outside the roost, past the wool, past the walls, out into the streets. People had begun standing on the walls at night to listen. The kingdom's finest dragon, in the kingdom's strongest keeping, and every night it screamed louder. 11 days until the kingdom counted everything it thought it owned. I crossed the stroke and went to sleep with my back against the egg. And the egg, for the first time since the vault, was warm without being fed. Something was coming. It had started to get ready. Maud was right, the way she was right about weather and rot and everything else that arrives on schedule. On the day the plank said 8, my father came up the yard road alone. No column, no carriage, no colors. A plain riding coat on a tired horse, and a lord I had last seen standing 1 step behind my brother's Triumph, now standing at a jawbone gate with his hat actually in his hands. I almost didn't know him. It wasn't the coat. It was the size. My father had been the largest fact in every room of my childhood, and the man at my gate was just a man, gray at the temples, with mud on good boots. I let him in. I let him in. I wanted to hear it. I walked him up the row myself, and I watched him take the yard's inventory, because watching people count had become my education. He counted wings the way the assessor had, 1, 2, 3, 4, and kept his face lordly through all of it. Then Great Bon raised his crowned head off the heir roof, and my father stopped walking. I watched the lordliness fail. I watched him red the ivory, the horn crown, the sheer impossible king-line size of him, and I watched his mouth start a question his position couldn't afford to ask. What did you feed? He caught it, folded it away, too late. Feed, not find, not tame, not bond. Feed. My father knew how the egg worked, and now we both knew he knew, and the yard got very quiet inside me. He looked at the doorpost when we passed it. 7 notches, the countdown plank, and above them the 3 carved lines. He read all 3, and he flinched at the 3rd, which told me the order his fears came in. He made his offer at the boundary stone, standing across the fresh-cut forge mark from me, the way the captain had stood across the writ. He made it the way lords transact ruin, quietly, completely, and in writing, laying the sealed instruments out on the stone one by one like a surgeon's tools. Reinstatement to the house. Heirship. The heirship. Over Edmund, over the double-crown champion, the thing no second son in our line had ever been offered. And a marriage contract, redrawn, her father's seal already on it. Everything back, he said. The name, the heirship over your brother, the girl, for the egg. I looked at the marriage contract longest because it made me the angriest. You're offering me a person like she's a horse, I said. Again. He had the grace not to answer that, and the sense not to defend it. Instead, he told me why, and this is the part I have turned over every night since, because my father was many things, but he was never once stupid. The gray was in the palace roost. Not 1 dragon, 4 now, the champion first among them, flecks becoming patches under the wing folds of the kingdom's finest, and the crown burning lamp oil until dawn to keep it quiet. The old law says cull. Nobody was going to cull the double-crown champion in a festival year. So it spread, and in 8 days, by crown decree, every bonded dragon in the kingdom, every flight, every house's pride, every winged thing under bond from every valley would be gathered wing to wing in one field for the counting. Do the arithmetic, boy, my father said, and his hands were not steady, and he did not bother hiding them anymore. You've seen what 1 fleck does to 1 animal. The tally puts the whole kingdom's blood in 1 pen. I am watching my country load itself onto a pyre and call it bookkeeping. Then stop the tally. No one stops the tally. The tally is the crown counting its power in public. Kings cancel their own coronations first. He looked at the egg then. I'd left it by the lean-to, black and patient in the middle distance, and his voice dropped out of lordship entirely. It does not hatch 1 dragon. It hatches all of them. Word for word. Word for word, the text that had risen out of the black from my palm, in a hall where he'd stood and let my inheritance be read out as 1 egg, presumed hollow. The words were mine. They had come to me. And my father wore them easily, like an old coat, like something he'd been taught young and remembered his whole life, and in that moment I understood that the house of Hargrave had known exactly what sat on that cradle for generations, and had let a hall full of guests laugh at it anyway. There was a lie somewhere in my family older than my exile. I couldn't see its shape yet. I could feel its edges, and they ran all the way back to the right. The egg goes to the house vault tonight, he said. The contingency belongs under the contingency's roof. When the gray comes, the crown will beg us, beg you, and House Hargrave will hold the only door out of the fire. Everything you built here proves you are the right keeper. So come home and keep it there. The right keeper. Even his surrenders were seizures. I looked at my father, and I did the arithmetic he'd taught me to do, the family arithmetic, the kind with no column for what things cost the people in them. Reinstatement to a hall that had laughed on cue. Heirship over a brother whose title was a scream behind wool. And her contract redrawn, seal already placed, the woman consulted never. Against a yard where 6 villagers came at midnight because the chalk wall said they could. A warden who handed me a spade instead of a speech. 7 notches, each one a name that answered when I called it. He was offering me back the family I'd lost. The trouble was, I had a better one now, and half of it could fly. No, I said. Not slammed. Set down the way Maud sets a spade blade up. Final, and pointed at the sky. My father gathered his instruments off the boundary stone one by one, unhurried, a man repacking a surgery nobody would let him perform, and I'll grant him this, he took it standing. At his horse, he paused, and looked back at the yard, at the wings on every roofline, at the paper wall on the heir door, at the mark on the stone that was not his mark anymore. Then the tally will take it legally, he said, and he rode south, small and straight-backed, down the road his money had once tried to melt, and the fog took him the way it took everything the yard had decided not to keep. I stood at the boundary stone a while. Then I crossed the day's stroke off the plank. 6. Behind me, unfed, untouched, the egg pulsed warm at my back like a second heart getting ready to be needed. Let it try, I said, to the egg, to the yard, to the arithmetic. 6 days. We left for the capital with 5 days on the plank, because the law that strips you always expects you to carry yourself to it. Maud stayed. We both knew she would before either of us said it. The yard holds the door, she said at the gate with the black key on its ring at her belt. I hold the yard. Go be counted. She put her hand once, briefly, on the egg's shell, the first time I ever saw her touch it, and whatever she said to it, she said without moving her lips. So the caravan that went south was this. 1 borrowed wagon with the egg riding in a barrow of straw, the boy driving it like he was transporting a king, which he was, me on the salvage horse, and 7 dragons rotating overhead in the watches dirge set without consulting me. The village turned out to see us onto the road. Nobody cheered. Nobody cheered. They stood along the chalk wall and touched their caps, which was worth more. For 3 days, the road was just a road. On the 4th evening, at the ford below the high pass, we found out where the wild flights had been going. Boyd's muster was already in the water when we crested the hill. 12 hunters and a merchant string caught mid-crossing at dusk, and coming down the pass wall above them, wrong, was a flight of 9. I knew wild drakes. These didn't move like anything wild. No circling, no testing, no fear of the torches. They came down the rock in a single silent line, all 9 heads set the same way, like beads pulled on one string, and every eye in the flight was gray to the rim, hollowed, hollowed. The whole flight, hollowed, and not one of them was hunting. They were migrating, south, corrupt, toward the capital, toward the field where the whole kingdom's blood would stand wing to wing in 2 days, pulled down that road by something none of them was alive enough to refuse. They only stopped for the ford because living things were in the way. What happened at that ford took 11 minutes, and the muster still tells it in taverns, and for once the tavern version is short of the truth. Squall took the sky first. She'd been the storm's apprentice all summer, and she came over the pass shoulder with the weather already leaning, a black cell that shoved the flight's rear guard out of the air and pinned the rest under a ceiling of wind. Grounded, they came on foot. That was the plan. On foot, they had to come through the line. On Ix was the line. He planted himself in front of the wagons, black-plated, low, and the first 2 hollowed things hit him at a full drive and stopped like carts hitting a bog. He didn't kill them. He didn't move either. That was the whole job, and nothing born was moving him off it. Redmaw walked a slow half-circle and breathed, and the ford's south bank became a wall of fire with exactly 1 gap in it, and the hollow did what even empty things do around fire. They took the gap. The gap was the kill box. Ver Dij Gris worked its edges like a jeweler. In, 1 cut to a wing root or a hamstring, out before anything turned, never killing, disassembling, and everyone she touched fought the rest of the fight crippled. Torrent held the river itself. 2 of the hollowed tried the deep water to flank the wagons, and the water folded over them like a hand closing, and my Fendrake was in it and under it and everywhere they weren't, and neither of them came up on our side. And Greatbone did the thing that taught me what we were actually fighting. He rose to his full height in the middle of the kill box and roared the Kingline challenge, the sound that had made a seizure column rediscover marching order, the sound that bends every living spine in a valley because 100 generations bred the bending into them. The hollowed didn't bend. They didn't even pause. 5 of them turned on him in that flat, string-pulled unison and attacked the largest thing on the field, and I watched my invincible one take the first real wounds of his life, and I went cold in a way the storm couldn't account for. Fear is a living thing's tax. The hollow don't pay it. Whatever waited under the palace, whatever the knock in the vault belonged to, it would not kneel to sighs, and it would not break for a roar, and every dominance my brood had ever won meant nothing to it. That lesson cost great bone, 2 gashes, and a notched horn, and it was cheap at the price. Dirge ended it, because ending it was his lineage's whole meaning. Tried the mercy first. I want that written on the first one, verdigris pinned. Dirge stood over it and breathed the low, slow fan, the plow drake's cure, the white fire that takes only what's dead. It took everything, it took everything. The thing under the gray didn't scream and didn't clear. It just stopped, and what settled out of the fire wasn't a healed animal. It was ash in the shape of one, holding for a heartbeat, and then the Ford's wind took it. There was nothing left inside to save. There hadn't been for a long time. Dirge looked at that ash longer than he'd ever looked at anything, and then he opened his ribs to full white, and he walked the killbox like a lamplighter, and he gave all 8 of the rest the same mercy at the only dose that worked. 11 minutes, 9 hollowed down. Not a hunter dead. 2 horses lost, 1 man's leg broken by a tail he'd never seen coming, the merchant string intact. The storm blew itself out downstream, and in the quiet after, Boyd walked up the bank to me, soaked to the ribs, hat gone, and stood in front of my horse. Grave luck, I said once. He said it loudly, in front of his whole muster, which I understood was the point. I'm a proud man, Warden, but I'm not a stupid one. The muster rides under you if you'll have us. The yard takes oaths and work, I said. Help us bury them. So, that's what the kingdom's hardest hunters did on the eve of the tally. They dug. We buried 9 hollowed wild dragons above the ford in graves. The brood clawed out themselves, onyx, moving earth like a foundation crew, the boy laying out the rows straight because he'd apprenticed under the best, and at each grave I turned the spade at the end, blade to the sky, the way Maud taught me, and 12 hunters watched and learned it. The Boneyard is not a place. I understood that at the ford. It's a law you carry, everything gets sorted, everything gets kept, nothing true gets thrown in a pit and forgotten. 2 of the 9 had died clean enough to read. A mountain drake, granite hided, its line pure back to the old cliff flights, and a dawn-crested wyvern, rose gold under the gray, a lineage I'd only ever seen in Maud's oldest ledger, marked extinct, buried nowhere. Those 2 we did not bury. I fed the egg the mountain drake at the night camp, with the muster standing witness and a ring of red moss fires, and for the first time the words rose bright enough for other men to see the glow off my face, though only I could read them. Lineage accepted, mountain drake, I brood, 8 forming. He hatched before the watch changed, gray as the pass walls, blunt-headed, sure-footed, entirely unimpressed by fire, storm, or squall's opinion of him. Bus salt, I said, and the words took it. Designate basalt, brood, 8 PS Dalta. The dawn-crested wyvern I fed last, in the cold hour, with more ceremony than I'd given anything since the High King, because her line was extinct, and what I held was the last of it, and the egg seemed to know. It took her bones slowly, gently, the way you take an heirloom out of a dying hand. Axes. Lineage accepted. Dawn, wyvern, dobbly 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 da, dobbly 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 da, dobbly da brood, 9, forming. 9. The 9th was forming as we broke camp, the shell veined white from base to crown and warm as a forge through the straw. It did not hatch on the road. All that last day it labored slow and patient, saving itself, and I let it ride its barrel like a queen and did not hurry it because I had stopped hurrying eggs the day I dug a grave past the frost line. We came over the last ridge at dusk, 2 strokes left on the plank, and stopped the caravan without anyone giving an order. The capital lay below us in the evening light, gold and enormous, the greatest roost city ever raised, a skyline built spire by spire around the wings that crowned it, and the sky above it was empty. No patrol flights, no festival wheels, no specks rising off the roost towers into the warm dusk air. The grandest perches in the world, and nothing on them, and the whole gold city crouched under that emptiness like a body holding its breath. Boyd reined in beside me and looked a long time. Where are their dragons, he said. Grounded, hidden, screaming behind wool, in numbers nobody was allowed to say out loud, and in 2 days, by law, every dragon left in the kingdom would land on that silence. The 9th of my dragons was born at dawn on tally day, on the edge of the counting field, in front of the arriving kingdom. I'd like to claim I staged it. I didn't. The egg had been saving her all through the last day's road, and when the first light came over the stands and touched the shell, the old seam opened like it had an appointment. She came out rose gold into rose gold light, dawn crested, the last of an extinct line returning on the one morning the whole kingdom was required by law to watch. SS. Dawn wyvern line. Designate, Dawn Fang, I said. Designate, Dawn Fang, brood, 9. And my brood went up to meet her. All of them, dirge first, 9 sets of wings rising off the field's edge into the sunrise at once, and their shadows swept the counting stands, and I watched 10,000 arriving people look up as my family briefly turned off the morning. That was how the tally began. The field was a valley floor dressed as a ledger, house pens in ranked rows, banners, weighing stations, and at the center, the counting table with the crown's roll upon it. The houses came in thin. I knew what full strength looked like. I'd grown up in it, and pen after pen held half flights, quarter flights, singles, proud banners over empty rails, and stewards with rehearsed reasons. Molting, resting, indisposed, grounded behind wool was what they meant. The gray had been busier than even my father knew. House Herr Graves' pen held one dragon, and it was the finest thing on the field, and I will say that plainly because the record deserves truth. The champion at full parade was gold the way the sun is, armored in ceremony, 20 spears of wing, the double-crown standard flying over it. Edmund walked at its shoulder in right metal and house colors, and the stands gave him the sound he had bought me from the cradle to hear. He found me across the field once. He looked at the 9 and at me for 3 long seconds, and there was arithmetic in his face, and for the first time in our lives it wasn't coming out in his favor. Then the counting began, and the herald took the roll. The same herald. Meh! The same voice that had stood in my father's hall over a laughing crowd and read out one egg, presumed hollow like the punchline it was built to be. House by house he called the holdings, and the field murmured at every thin number, and the crown's clerks wrote it all down, and the ledger of the kingdom's power got shorter with every row of pens. And then he reached the last entry, and his voice found its old smirk, because some men never audit their material. And, attending by summons, the exile of the Boneyard holding one egg, presumed. 9 dragons landed behind me. They came down in dirges formation, in unison, in a spread the width of a house pen, Great Bon at the center like a keep tower taking its ground, Dawnfang catching the light on his right, and the impact of 9 settlings rolled through the field floor and into the stand's feet. The herald's sentence died in his mouth. In front of the whole kingdom, mid-smirk, the punchline got up and looked at him. Into that silence, from the counting table, the assessor of the crown stood and read the true entry off her own report in a clerk's clean, carrying voice, with 3 years of unsaid things pressed flat under the words. Holding of the warden of the Boneyard. Dragons, living, bonded, 9. Friar looked up from the roll, straight at me, only for a moment. Count confirmed, she said, and sat down. 9. Read into the crown's own ledger, by the crown's own officer, off the crown's own page. Let the record show the hall's laughter, and then let it show this, the sound 10,000 people make when they revise an opinion all at once. It isn't a gasp. It's lower than that. It's the sound a stand's worth of wood makes when everyone leans forward at the same time. I stood in it and thought of a doorpost with 9 notches and a plank with no strokes left, and I crossed nothing off because the countdown was over. The count was made. The tally could close its book. It never got the chance. The champion was on its 3rd parade circuit when it happened. The lap of honor, the crown's showpiece, led shining past the stands while the clerks totaled. Mid-stride in front of everyone, the finest dragon in 200 years stumbled like a cart horse. It caught itself, went on 3 more steps, and then its right wing simply stopped holding its line and dragged, gold feathers of scale scraping the counting field, and the parade harness pulled sideways, and the whole grand animal went down on one knee joint with a sound like a bell falling. The stands rose. The stands rose. Edmund reached it first, hands on its jaw, shouting for handlers, and the harness girth, strained by the fall, tore a ceremonial plate loose from the champion's flank, and the kingdom saw what was under the goal. Not a fleck, a lattice. Gray spread in a web across the flank the size of a tabletop, deep in the scale beds, pulsing faintly with the animal's pulse. Months of it, wool hidden, purse silenced, growing all this time under the parade armor. Someone in the stands said the word, not whispered, said, and then it was everywhere at once. The word 100 years of law had taught this kingdom to dread, hitting 10,000 people in one breath. The gray, the gray, the gray, the gray. The field became arithmetic. Every house that had brought its thin, precious remnant of a flight did the same sum at the same moment. My dragons are standing wing to wing with that, and the tally's beautiful ranked rows dissolved into stewards hauling at pen gates and dragons being mobbed toward the road. And then the roost towers answered. Over the Capitol walls, in the city itself, a scream went up from the palace roost. The night scream, the wool-buried scream, in the middle of the morning. And it did not stop, and a second scream joined it, and a third, and on the highest tower, a roost door burst outward, and handlers spilled onto the walkway ahead of something none of us could see. Palace roost was dropping. All of it, at once. And in all that panic, 10,000 people did one more sum, and I watched the answer arrive on face after face after face, turning row by row like a field, turning to the sun. 9 dragons stood on the counting field in perfect calm, stone-born, grave-raised, untouched by the gray, and led by the exile from the valley where the last plague was beaten into the ground. The story had run ahead of me my whole exile. Now it came back for me. The Boneyard cure, a house matriarch said, loud, standing, pointing her whole arm at me across the panicking field. The grave blessed one, him. The kingdom that had laughed me onto a prison cart was now looking at me the way the 6 villagers had looked at me at midnight, and there were 10,000 of them, and I understood my father completely for one cold second. Whoever held this moment held the crown's whole future in his fist. That was when I felt it through my boots. The field went strange underfoot, a pressure, a presence rolling slow beneath the grass like something enormous shouldering along a hallway, and then unmistakable up through the earth of the counting field into 10,000 pairs of feet. A knock. Single, deliberate, unhurried. The sound from behind the sealed door, the sound 5 generations of wax and lead and iron had been listening to in the dark under my yard, here, under the capital, under the panic, under a field holding every healthy dragon left in the kingdom, gathered wing to wing in one place, exactly as the law required. Dirge's fire came up. Great Bond turned slowly to face the palace and did not roar. He had learned what didn't bend. The egg on my back went hot as a stove. We had sealed the door, all those generations of wardens and I. Nobody had sealed the ground. Counting field split open along a vein of black glass, and the first hollowed came up out of the kingdom's foundations like a memory the ground had failed to keep down. It did not climb out, it assembled, up out of the seam in a rising tide of fused, stone, dark bone, peace-finding peace, a century of stolen dead pouring themselves into one shape. The shape was a dragon, if a dragon could be built by grief out of everything it had buried. Bigger than Great Bond, bigger than the champion. Gray-eyed to the rim, 5 claws to the foot, and I had read those 5-clawed gouges by lantern light on the inside of an iron door, and now the door's story stood on the counting field in front of 10,000 people. Every gray-touched dragon in the capital screamed at once. Then, all at once, they stopped, and that silence was worse because it was the silence of instruments picked up by their player. The first hollowed opened its jaws and did not roar. It exhaled. A slow gray breath like fog off a winter pit, and the nearest penned dragon, a house's last proud silver, took the breath full and hollowed in front of us in the time it takes to gasp. Eyes to gray, strings pulled taut. A living animal became a glove. That was its whole way of war. Demonstrated once, efficiently for the stands, it did not want a battlefield. It wanted an orchestra. And through the walls, from the roost towers, its instruments were already coming. The palace flights, wool-blind and screaming no longer, rising over the capital in that flat string-pulled unison and turning toward the field where every healthy dragon in the kingdom stood conveniently gathered. The kingdom's law had built its plague a banquet, and the banquet was seated. 10,000 people broke for the road at once, and I climbed onto the counting table with the egg blazing hot against my back, and I did the thing the yard had been training me for since the first night the gate boomed. I took the field. Boyd Lanes stands to the road, muster on the gates. Your stewards, pens open, dragons down, wings flat. And to the 9 behind me, the only order that mattered, the one I'd built call by call from a lean-to doorstep, brood, hold the valley. They held it lineage by lineage, in front of every house in the kingdom, and I will set it down here the way the kingdom saw it, because this is the part the songs get almost right. Squall took the sky away. She rose to meet the incoming roost flights with the whole morning's weather in her teeth, and she built a storm ceiling over the field wall to wall, and the hollowed flyers hit her headwind like birds hitting glass and were shoved, wing over wing, down onto the ground she chose for them. Onyx and basalt were that ground. Bodplate and mountain hide, they stood the evacuation lanes like harbor walls, and everything hollowed that was herded at the crowds hit one of the 2 of them and stopped, and nothing born or unborn moved either of them 1 foot. Redmow wrote fire across the field in corridors, never touching a scale, bending the grounded, hollowed away from the stands, funneling them into a box of flame with exactly 1 exit, and the exit was water. Tor Ent held the canal. What entered it, he took under and pinned to the stone bed, and held there with the patience of a river. Living things drown, but hollowed things only stop, and stopping them was all we needed. And into that pinned, boxed, grounded harvest went Vertige Gree and Dirge, the jeweler and the lamplighter, Vertige Gree shearing wing tendons so nothing could rise again, Dirge walking the rows with the low white fan, burning the gray out of every instrument that still had a musician inside. Not all of them did. I saw him pause over a pinned drake, read it with his nose and give it the other dose, and I counted every one of those, and the count was 6, and I will carry the 6. But the ones that cleared, dozens, then more, woke sane and shaking on the wet stone, dragons again, and dragged themselves out of the fight they'd been warned to. That left the player. The first hollowed had watched its orchestra be taken from it note by note with those rim-gray eyes, unhurried, uninterested in fear, and then it had simply started walking toward me, not toward the crowds, not toward the brood, toward the counting table and the black shell blazing on my back. Of course, the egg was the one thing on the field it had reason to hate, the answer forged against it while it hammered at its door, the cradle of every flight that would ever refuse it. So I did what the yard taught me. I let the trap feed the engine. I stood my ground on the table, egg burning between my shoulders, and let the oldest monster in the kingdom commit to its lunge, and Greatbone, who had been lying flat along the stand's shadow line being mistaken for architecture, rose up out of it and took the first hollowed by the neck. King Lion against the king of nothing. He did not roar at it, he had learned. He locked his jaws behind its skull, wrapped it in wings and weight, and anchored, and the two biggest things the kingdom had ever seen went down together, plowing the counting field into a trench. It could not hollow him fast. He was too much life to drink through one bite. But he was drinking. I watched the gray start into his ivory at the jawline, and I understood we had one hold and no second. Dirge? He came off, the cure rose like the first night, like the thrown spear off the trophy wall, and the first hollowed, pinned, drinking, patient, played its last and finest instrument. The champion hit Dirge out of the air. Gold against bone white, 20 spears of wing against my first hatched, the lattice on its flank pulsing like a second heart. The kingdom's greatest dragon, half-hollowed and wholly aimed, thrown at us by the thing that wore it. And my whole brood pulled their blows, because I was screaming hold, because the law of the yard is the law of the yard, the sick are not the enemy. The sick are the cargo. Dirge understood before I finished screaming it. He stopped fighting the champion entirely. He took its claws across his shoulder. I have the scar in my keeping now, one more entry in the ledger, and he wrapped it, wings and legs, the way he'd flattened Squall on her first morning, and he put his ribs against its gold ribs, and he lit. Not the needle, not the fan. The whole dose, the deep, slow, terrible mercy, poured point blank into the finest dragon in 200 years. The gray came out of the champion like a skin being torn off a drum. It tore free in a whole writhing lattice, screaming with a voice that was never the champion's, and the white fire ate it in the air over both of them, and the gold dragon underneath went down in the trench mud, still, clean, empty of everything but itself. For 3 heartbeats, nothing on that field breathed. Then the champion stood up. It stood up new. Gold the way it had been gold on the festival dais, eyes clear as coins, the scream gone out of its body, and it turned its head slowly, and it looked at the handlers running at it with leads and hooks and my brother's colors on their coats. My brother's stolen champion tore free of its handlers. It whopped through them like weather. It crossed the wrecked counting field, past the pinned hollowed, past my whole watching brood, past Edmund, who was shouting its parade name over and over, holding up the right medal like a receipt, and it did not once turn its head to him. And it knelt at my feet. 20 spears of wing, folded to the mud of a gravekeeper's shadow. The double-crowned champion kneeling to the exile in front of every house in the kingdom, while my brother screamed that it was impossible. He was still screaming it when Briar stood up at the counting table with the right register open in her hands. She had gone to it in the panic, a crown assessor verifying the bond status of a collapsed asset, doing her job amid the apocalypse because that is who she always was. And she had found the page and read it, and now she read it to the kingdom in the clerk's carrying voice, each word placed like a stone on a grave. Right of bonding, 16th year. The gold egg, highest grade in 200 years, marked a light for the second son. The field's silence had a texture now. She kept reading. Peeper's entry, same hour, countersigned Lord Hargrave, alignment reassigned to the first son. Reassigned, she looked up. Eggs do not reassign. Eggs do not reassign. The record is falsified. The gold egg never bonded Edmund Hargrave. It chose, and it was overruled, and its choice is on this page. The egg does the choosing. Every heir in the valley learns it at 10. Across the field, my brother stopped screaming. The medal hung forgotten from his fist, and 10,000 people turned from the register to look at him. It had chosen at the right, before I ever reached the dais, and my father had let my brother lift my dragon off my cradle and write his own name over the choosing. And for every night since, in a stall packed with wool, the finest dragon in 200 years had screamed for the keeper it could see across a hall, a city, a kingdom, and never reach. The scream finally had its reason, and the reason was kneeling in front of me with its head bowed, home. Behind it, in the trench, the first hollowed heaved against Greatbond's failing hold, and found 10 dragons standing over it in a ring, and a gold champion rising from its knee with the sun coming off it like judgment, and one gravekeeper walking forward with ash on his hands. Greatbond, I said, open its jaws. He wrenched the dead mouth wide. Dirge stepped to the gap, ribs already white. The oldest trick in my yard, the first one I ever saw him do, at an Os-U heir gate at 3 paces, for a dead thief. Burn it out, I said. He put the whole white dose down the first hollowed's throat, and the champion poured its gold fire in over Dirge's white like a crown being set on a blade, and the thing made of the kingdom's stolen dead burned from the inside of its history outward. It did not scream. It emptied, a century of gray unraveling off its frame and sheets, eaten white in the air, and the fused black bones of the culled came apart, piece released from piece, and fell across the trench like a burial finally allowed to finish. The ash came down over the counting field, soft as snow, and it came down white. And every gray thing left in the capital went quiet at once. Not the puppet quiet, the other one. The sick, surviving, waiting to be cured. The war was an orchestra, and we had not killed the music. We had freed the instruments. The verdicts came fast, because kingdoms that have just watched their foundations open prefer their bookkeeping brisk. Watered tap, they were read from the counting table 3 days later to a field still trenched and ash white by the same herald's voice that had read my inheritance to a laughing hall and died mid-smirk at the count. Third time reading my family. He had finally learned the material. Edmund Hargrave, stripped. The right medal, the airship, the champion's registry, the house colors, item by item, in that carrying voice, in front of the same stands that had cheered him at the festival. He took it standing. I'll give him that much, the way the captain took the melted road. At the end, he looked across the field at me. One long look, no screaming left in it, just the arithmetic, finally done, and a man seeing the remainder. I didn't look away, and I didn't gloat. The yard sorts. It doesn't spit. Friar came to me before the assessors rode south, with the ribbon untied from her seal, held out flat on her open hand. 3 years it had lived on other wrists, his, then the crown's. It was always yours by right, she said. Like everything else they moved. No, I said, and closed her fingers back over it, gently, the way you close a ledger. It followed the record. The record's mended now. Follow what you choose this time, and it'll be worth more to whoever gets it. No cruelty in it, no door either. She nodded once, assessor to warden, and rode south with the crown, and her report on the new roost, I'm told, was flawless. My father knelt on the counting field in front of every house, the day the falsified page was entered into the crown's record with his countersignature facing the sun. Lord Hargrave, on his knees to the second son, in public, with nothing left to offer and nothing left to seize. She follows the dragon, he told me once, about the breaking of my life like it was weather, so I let his kneeling be weather too. I saw it, I noted it, the way you note rain. And I walked on to my dragons and left him kneeling in his own climate, acknowledged by everyone and forgiven by no one, which was the correct count. The crown, whose surviving flights were sick, whose champion had chosen a gravekeeper, and whose plague had just been burned out of the earth by bone-born wings, did the only arithmetic left on the table. By charter read in that same week, the Boneyard, first roost of the new flights. Its vault, a sealed grave in perpetuity, the knock has not come again, Maud checks, out of craft, not fear. And its keeper, warden of the flights, of all of them, everywhere the gray had been, with a wage of crown gold, a wall of my own papers, and standing orders every house had to learn to pronounce, the sick fly to the yard, and the yard burns them clean, and nobody anywhere is thrown in a pit alive again. The gold champion came home with us, because home is where the choosing is. 10 sets of wings over the caravan north. Boyd's muster rode escort the whole way and swore they'd have done it free, and Maud met us at the jawbone gate with the ledger open and counted us through it one by one, out loud, because some numbers deserve the voice. The boy cut the 10th notch himself. He'd earned the knife. Within the month the envoys came, and this part I set down last because it is not an ending. 2 of them, from 2 different kingdoms across the ranges, arriving the same week with the same hunger dressed in different colors. Both had heard. Both had plagues of their own, old culls of their own, and, they said it almost shyly, boneyards of their own, vast ones, full and sordid and waiting. And one of them carried, wrapped in silk like a relic, a black egg. Their crown's own vessel, kept a secret twin to mine for 100 years, cold, silent, and refusing them. They had touched it, all their heirs and kings, generation after generation. It had never once lit. It would not light for them now. It was already warm before they finished unwrapping it. I could feel it from across the yard, reaching, the way mine had reached for my palm in a laughing hall. But that is the next account, and this one is owed its ending. It got it at dawn, on the first morning of the new roost, when I walked out of the lean-to with my tea and found all 10 of them on the ridgeline. Dirge at the point, the champion's gold-catching first light, Dawnfang making the sunrise look derivative, 10 sets of wings opening over the valley where the kingdom threw its dead, and the whole yard shining white below them like a thing planted in rows. They thought they were burying me with the bones. They were planting them.